Thank you. Well, so thank you again for this invitation, and I look forward very much to our conversation at the end of my lecture, and do my very best to respond to any questions that you may wish to ask. It's great to be with a group from many different places, and I feel very privileged to be able to share these ideas with you. I want to begin with a recent conversation that I listened to 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I'll explain something about the dialogue, the discussion that was, because I think it's a good place to begin. The question about what it means to reason in today's attempts to communicate in a way that seems to be self-evident appears to be rather strange. Children, we believe, are expected to learn from an early age, at the level they can understand, what is a reasonable way of expressing their thoughts and ideas to other people. We think we know how to discern what is a rational proposition and what is irrational. We all believe that on the whole, we are rational people. At least I imagine that we do. We know how to discuss matters in a measured manner that abides by principles of logical argument that everyone else recognizes as the right way to communicate with one another. And if we don't do this, of course, then communication tends to break down. And yet, there can be strong disagreements about claims that people make about what is true, and even whether the concept of truth itself can be defended any longer. A week or two ago, then, I listened to a broadcast debate between two prominent academics with its title, "What is Truth in a Post-Truth World?" At a number of points, they disagreed on fundamental issues about the nature of truth, or indeed whether in the contemporary intellectual environment one can speak meaningfully about truth as a reality at all. So here are some of the highlights of their exchange. The dialogue was set up on purpose to be a dialogue between two people who rather disagreed. To speak of a post-truth world is to turn to a world where subjective feelings become the measure of what the present generation is prepared to accept as being true for each individual. Thus, in a discussion about what is right to believe and how to act, two people may appeal to the distinction between what is my truth and what is your truth. The main criterion for how a person relates to what they believe to be true is basically what they feel comfortable about. In other words, truth becomes a purely subjective, personalized feeling about what gives people pleasure, and its opposite, falsehood, what causes them to be disturbed, or to be irritated, or to be angry. Objective facts about a matter no longer persuade people to base their opinions and lifestyle on what can be proved by overwhelming, reliable evidence. The problem is, so it is said, that facts can easily be twisted and manipulated. No longer can they be relied upon to judge what is true and what is false. Now, according to this idea, this process, the outcome is a complete moral relativism, where every moral judgment is subjected to individual preferences. What I believe that on social media is sometimes codified as either you like it or you dislike it. Any truth claim is judged within a particular framework of belief, which might well echo one's cultural heritage or one's ideological leaning. We see everything through the kind of glasses we put on, often for reasons of self-interest. This being where social forces have landed us, we cling to the perspectives that we find most appealing. Now this should, so we are told, lead to a tolerant world, where no universally recognized objective truth can be discovered that divides individuals or groups into antagonistic adversaries. Reason, therefore, in a post-truth world has its limits. It cannot compel us, by its appeal to incontrovertible evidence, to believe that certain facts about the external world are actual and real, because they are both accurate and correct. So to continue the discussion about what is a post-truth world, the problem about truth is if it comes from an external source. We should all start with the notion that there is nothing good and nothing evil in the world. But we, from within our highly personalized consciousness, impose moral right and wrong according to our own experiences of life. We project what is good and evil for us, according to what effects these characteristics have for us. In other words, we accept or deny, what we accept or deny depends on what consequences they produce for our individual lives. For example, if I hate some people, I soon discover that unconditional hatred has negative consequences for my well-being. We don't need someone else to tell us what to believe or do. What motivates us to believe or act in certain ways are just the things that produce positive results in our world. So I have to make up my mind from my experience what is valuable in life and then act on it. Objective truth is therefore dangerous because it cannot be challenged. It is incompatible with individual freedom. We need the autonomy to be independent of other people's certainties so that we can discover who we are and grow into that reality. Now, that is some of the arguments that are used to confirm that culture now operates in a post-truth world. However, there is another side to the argument about truth and rationality. Truth matters in order that we can discern what is in error, inaccurate, a misunderstanding, a fallacy, or just plain wrong. This requires the ability to reason in a way that is logical and coherent, that the conclusion of an argument, for example, does not contradict the premises on which the mode of reasoning is based. It should be based on the necessity of antithesis, so that truth claims can be judged to be either right or wrong. The truth about what is real in the world has to make sense. It has to produce beliefs and actions that we can actually live by. A post-truth world leads to a post-justice world. Let us take a very contemporary example. It is true that Russia has signed up to a United Nations treaty that protects the complete independence of Ukraine as a sovereign nation. Its signature to the treaty cannot be denied. The treaty forbids external interference in the life of the Ukrainian people. An invasion of its territory, therefore, is a complete contradiction of the decision it made to recognize the independence of this nation. All these facts are undoubtedly true. It is therefore a major untruth to repudiate the arguments it used when it signed the treaty. Moreover, it also contradicts other treaties that have affirmed its previous adherence to a long list of human rights. If only feelings dictate knowledge about facts, and the post-Putin Russian government feels that Ukraine should be an integral part of its sovereign sphere of influence, then its stance is based on subjective categories, such as fear, remorse, shame, and grief. But if justice is to prevail in international relations, it is not just because it will produce peace, but because justice is an objective reality that demands compliance. The alternative to this in international relations is the situation described at the very end of the Book of Judges. In those days, all the people did what was right in their own eyes. So morality cannot just be a collective decision. What about moral revolutionaries? How is it possible to justify the actions they have taken to challenge and overturn evil laws and actions, such as slavery, female genital mutilation, trafficking of women and young girls for sexual usage, or torture, racial injustices, to name but a few, if truth is not universally recognized and upheld? So it is dishonest to claim that truth claims are dangerous because they are often bigoted. Only human beings are bigoted. Truth claims can, of course, be wrong. They can be manipulated to push the particular agenda of a campaigning group. One such claim would be that of gender-confused young people, that they are more likely to commit suicide if they are refused hormone treatment in the false hope that they can change their gender and thereby alleviate their confusion. Such a claim can be debunked by carefully constructed longitudinal research on thousands of young people. One such has been undertaken in Sweden in recent years. The results show that statistically the claim is false. So there are proven ways of validating or falsifying truth claims. They are based on a careful assessment of the evidence adduced for making them. Are the sources reliable? Do the people who make them have a history of being reliable in affirming certain allegations? Or can their affirmations be exposed as being the result of pushing a certain ideological opinion? Things are true if they measure up to what actually exists and can be demonstrated by a judicious weighing of all relevant evidence in their favor, and of course in the rejection of arguments against their trustworthiness. From here, I want to move on to rationality as it is exercised in the scientific world and scientific discoveries. The work of scientists depends for its success on the ability to follow correctly certain rational principles of investigation. Insofar as science continues to function adequately, producing new understandings of the working of the natural world, it is an irreversible part of the fabric of life. It is therefore a curious paradox that the claims of science are denigrated by some, and the rationality on which it is based is dismissed. And yet, the achievements of science are adhered to and depended on. Just to give one example, the most complete answer to post-truth assertions is, I believe, to do what many of us have done on many occasions, to entrust ourselves at a speed of roughly 240 kilometers an hour, or 150 miles an hour if you measure speed in that way, on an airport runway, to the conclusive knowledge achieved by aeronautical engineers. An indisputably affirmative answer to the question, "And will it fly?" is sufficient to quell a basic disbelief in the reality of at least some scientific conclusions as being true. Over and over again, the scientific method has demonstrated its capacity to reach and chart an irreducible reality in the material world. We should therefore conclude that there exist certain objective laws of nature. In the above example, those investigated by the science of aerodynamics, whose valid formulation and practicality is precisely what explains why aircraft fly in accordance with those laws. The proven track record of scientific discovery and subsequent technological development is inexplicable on any other grounds than those which confirm that unequivocal knowledge of the real world is established. The success of science in the empirical testing of hypotheses derived from a general account of gathered data, and in the ability to make positive predictions on the basis of theories, points to an utterly reliable structure to the universe. Humanity, therefore, can dismiss as fantasy any proposition that anyone may put forward that humans are able to create a different kind of basic reality based entirely on how they feel. Thousands of further examples could be given of the logic of scientific research, on whose results we depend daily for health and our well-being. Secondly, I will go on to talk about rationality as it is exercised in legal processes. In ordinary life, in accordance with what we may call a common sense view, truth refers to a belief or statement about an event or fact that corresponds to the reality to which it refers. We sometimes phrase it by saying, "It is the case that." For example, this morning it started raining at exactly 9:34 hours. Just about did happen this morning, in reality here, where I am reading from. This is a true statement, but it is only true if, and only if, in fact, the first drops of rain fell when the atomic clock registered 0.0934 hours. The ability to check out the truth of a claim by seeing how it agrees with a certain set of circumstances is a necessary assumption for any conversation. As, for example, in another statement, sadly, Alfred Smith, who is a fictitious character, has just been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The assertion to be true has to correspond to a scan or an X-ray that shows a malignant growth in the pancreas. This understanding of truth is applied rigorously in a court of law, where statements purporting to be true, for example, I was some 50 miles or 80 kilometers away from the scene of the murder when it happened, have to be supported by incontrovertible evidence before they can be accepted as what was actually the case. If the truth of the matter cannot be ascertained by reliable witnesses or some other material proof, there is no way of judging whether the claim may be a mistake due to poor memory or a deliberate fabrication intended to deceive the judge and jury into thinking there was a convincing alibi. Discovering the truth of a matter is paramount in all trials, and it is particularly important in cases of the miscarriage of justice, when fresh evidence or a reassessment of existing evidence points to errors of fact or the interpretation of fact in the case of the first trial. So far, so good, one might say. It would be a brave or a foolhardy person who did not hold to a correspondence theory of truth when he or she was the one being falsely accused of a crime and was trying to clear their name. However, when we move from statements about events in the world, scientific or under the jurisdiction of law, that can be verified or falsified, to statements about aesthetic judgments, for example, about the undoubted beauty and significance of a particular painting, a piece of music, a sunset, or whatever it might be, or about moral values, such as the integrity and sanctity of all human life, or religious beliefs, for example, the affirmation that Jesus Christ rose to new life 3 days after he was declared dead and had been buried, the situation becomes a little more complicated. And the matter of complexity is, of course, true for any theory about how truth claims can be justified. But I think there is a way, and I want to talk a little bit about that now for a short while. It is the inference to the best explanation, IBE. Knowledge that is entirely derived from below, that is by inference from data acquired from material sources, as in the cases of scientific research and legal processes, is intrinsically incapable of discovering the whole truth about what it means to be human. What is required, in addition to knowledge from below, is knowledge from outside. Just as science operates within the framework of a given material reality, so, in order to complete the circle of knowledge, there needs to be another reality available, which tells us what otherwise we could not know. Within the Christian tradition of thought, of course, this, as we all know, is called revelation or divine disclosure. What is required if we are to obtain justified true belief about matters that cannot be settled by appeal to empirical data alone? In other words, how can we arrive at a unified body of knowledge that just does justice to human reality in this world in all its manifold aspects? And it seems to me that the heuristic device known as inference to the best explanation may serve as a fruitful tool for concluding what is the ultimate truth of any matter. The best explanation is unlikely to be necessarily the simplest explanation, just because the latter tends to reduce complexity to what can be handled by unaided human reason, and as a result ignores substantial pieces of evidence on methodological grounds. However, when the simplest explanation does not explain, a more comprehensive one, if available, has to be sought. So IBE, inference to the best explanation, works by comparing alternative explanations of the data of experience. Inherently, it incorporates into its method of working any evidence that seems to be germane to the case. Nothing is ruled out a priori. The best explanation is at one and the same time the explanation most warranted by all relevant evidence, and the one that would, if true, provide the best understanding. I make this claim, that this heuristic device is the most adequate way of engaging in a dialogue between the Christian faith and the predicament of secular post-Enlightenment culture concerning how powers of human reason can be authenticated, and the question of what is true and how we can be sure. I would further argue that in this sense it amply fulfills the criteria for being a missiological project, just because intercultural and interfaith dialogue is one aspect of the Church's missionary mandate. Before citing instances of the way in which IBE can work in the context of the dialogue with a so-called post-truth culture, particularly in current Western discourse, we need to deal with the criticism of the method itself, namely that it is not the purpose of Christian faith to give explanations. But it can be shown that science is unable on its own terms to give an adequate explanation of why its own procedures are highly successful. But on the Christian faith, understood as a Trinitarian theistic realism, produces a refined explanation that does precisely justice to the question, why is the scientific method so profoundly able to do its job? It also gives a coherent explanation of the origin and justification of moral sentiments and judgments, showing that it is not possible to derive intrinsic prescriptive demands, moral demands, from a naturalistic view of the world. Now, let us suppose that this discussion is applied to arguments about the causal events that have produced us, people, Homo sapiens, as we know ourselves. The best explanation becomes the one that has the ability to give a more probable solution to the question, how has human life arisen? And if this is then cast in the form of the likeliest originating set of circumstances, then we may adduce Judeo-Christian theism, the belief in the infinite personal creator God revealed in the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments, as the most probable explanation of what is called the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is a proposition that speaks of the necessary conditions existing for the emergence of human beings on this particular planet within a vast universe. If the theistic explanation is correct, the chance of human beings coming into existence is 100%, because the will of the Creator will have been accomplished. If, on the other hand, the naturalist explanation is correct, the chance is greatly reduced, I would say almost to zero. For the probability that the events necessary for human beings to have shown up out of an impersonal evolutionary process is almost inconceivable. For only the slightest, minutest variation in the initial conditions and subsequent developments would have caused the process to finish up with being utterly sterile. Now, this does not equate to demonstrating the truth of the theistic hypothesis, but makes it both extremely probable and all other theories about human life on Earth extremely improbable. In answer to these difficulties and applying the theory of inference to the best explanation to the question of a theistic or non-theistic universe, one can readily admit that there cannot be as great a degree of conviction about the truth of the matter as is the case of scientific investigation. But this is because the evidence is of a different class. This is in the nature of the case, for we are dealing here with two kinds of reality, and therefore two kinds of knowledge, the external world and the internal world of the human experience of being human. In the latter case, the observer also becomes the observed, and therefore is highly engaged in a personal and subjective exploration of her own sense of being and identity. The challenge of being entirely honest about questions that affect our own self-understanding is immense. How does one begin to stand outside one's own formation as a human being in order to have an impartial and unprejudiced vantage point? Fortunately, it is precisely this heuristic means of arriving at the greatest possible approximation to the truth that can overcome subjective partialities. IBE is a rational consideration of all claimants to know the ultimate reality that lies behind the experience of being human. No claim to know the ultimate meaning of life is excluded prior to debating the alternatives. All can be part of the dialogue, which proceeds by way of testing the claims against one another and against the stubborn facts of human life in the world. Naturally, there is no final human arbiter. Each person or group has to decide for itself how far its intuition, common sense, philosophy of life, whether it is homespun or borrowed, ideology or religion, is best able to make sense of the wider spread of the reality of life. So the process is one of advocacy, in which alternative explanations are promoted, discussed, and judged. It is assumed that where there are conflicting claims, they cannot both be valid. When it comes to knowledge in the realm of human self-awareness, this is almost certainly the best way of arriving at an understanding of how and why things are as they are. This is a non-dogmatic bottom-up approach. If alternative explanations are treated fairly, on the basis of considering the opinions of others as one would wish others to consider one's own, the most favorable condition for arriving at a knowledge of the truth can prevail. The method in its application to the dilemma concerning rationality and truth can heal the breach between knowledge of facts and mere opinions, between public truth and private beliefs. It is exemplified in a book by Keith Ward, a former professor in the University of Oxford, in which he concludes by arguing that as an explanation of human experience in the universe, materialism, as an alternative to theism, is deficient in its ability to explain a number of ultimate questions. What is the final basis of matter? What is consciousness about? Moral sensibility, the universal longing for a sense of purpose, the commitment to rational thinking, and indeed the existence of the universe itself. These are precisely the questions, and there are others, such as aesthetic appreciation and the intrinsic dignity of human beings, which are unanswerable on the basis of a truncated materialistic view of reality. It is curious, therefore, however, that a theistic worldview rejected by metaphysical materialism gives a perfectly adequate rational explanation of each one of these questions. It is perhaps not surprising that some atheists are even prepared to concede that although in their opinion theism is false, human beings nevertheless function better on the supposition that it is true. This, of course, though not a demonstration of its truth, may be a reliable indication. I come on finally to the second part of my talk, the renewing of the mind. We have dealt a little bit now with the question of reason and truth. The outcome of this previous discussion.
Excuse me, Professor. Yeah. Would it be helpful, do you think, if we gave people an opportunity to engage with the argumentation, the very close argumentation you've given in that section before we come to the second part? I just wonder whether people would like to engage with you on some of those, very helpful but very, compact argument before we go to the second part.
Yeah, I'm very happy with that, yes.
Dr. Adam, might we do that?
So we're opening it for discussion, opening what has already been said to questions, to disagreements, to comments. If anybody would like to engage.
I think one question I'd like to put to the group is, This is all going on in Western society. How much is this infecting and affecting thinking in other parts of the world, in the global south? How much has this sort of seeped into the public discourse in your countries and churches? That might be an interesting question.
Any responses?
I'm going to ask Solomon Abasi. He usually has an opinion on something. Solomon, how much is this affecting folk in Nigeria? Is he there?
Is he there?
How much is this affect? How much is this subjectivity affecting people, or is it not so much? Nobody?
Hi, Chris.
Come on, Stephen.
Well, this is a very interesting subject which you bring up, because I know we've discussed this on a number of occasions. This issue of the approach to knowledge and whether a Western formulated approach is in some way making research into the other contexts, say the South or the Islamic world, whether that approach then becomes compromised. Because this is it's a long and deep discussion on the nature of research, and Dr. Kirk has outlined this issue of how we come to make a decision by this idea of the comparing of facts. You know, that phrase that came up earlier about facts do not care about feelings, because that is something which is the luxury of science, in the sense that you can test something and it can be if you can reproduce it under the same conditions, then it would indicate that it's true. But the issue then is this desire for objectivity, and there are objections outside the Western intellectual environment, should we call, if I were to call it that. It's actually it's not Western. It may have been midwifed in the West, but it doesn't belong to the West. There's this rooting of the scientific method in the natural sciences, and the question is, of course, and Chris, what you were bringing up was whether this scientific methodology can be applied to matters that are anthropological, or matters of culture, or even matters of faith. And I think, you know, in early discussions, we sort of argued that there is an advantage of a starting point, which Dr. Kirk has underlined, that there is a need for the approach towards objectivity, almost on the scientific model. This is something which is still controversial, but I mean, I've particularly come across this in the Islamic world, with its attempt to reconstruct the premises of epistemology, on the grounds that the epistemology that they are coming across is they are trying to demonize it as a Western construction, almost as a conspiratorial construction to deconstruct Islam. But the issue there is that they've gone down a blind alley into trying to establish an alternative scientific methodology, which somehow will be more in harmony with Islamic starting points. But the issue there, as Chris, as you brought up, is it really possible to suggest that we should nuance Western, sorry, I'm avoiding that word Western, contemporary epistemological methods? Should we attempt to nuance them in order to accommodate other cultural practices, or whether this is, and this is the core issue, or whether we're getting far too worried about the conception of identity as being a validating factor? That whole argument that Dr. Kirk was bringing about the post-truth world seems to be focused on an identity identity preoccupation, which we're suffering from in the West, that identity takes precedence over actual truth. And just to round off on this, I think it's pretty obvious that in the field of ethics, where we say my truth, your truth, what I perceive to be moral or you perceive to be moral, is an entire product of narcissism. I mean, I've met narcissists, and in discussions with them, I was quite fascinated to find out that their moral compass actually was, when it came down to it, that which acted in their own interests was a moral good, and that which acted against their own interests was a moral evil. There was no objectivity about this. There was no idea about the other, because it was his truth that was important, and any other person's perception of truth, it was not relevant. So it's identity preoccupation and narcissism, and I fear that this is seeping into the idea of, shall we say, cultural pluralism and the necessity to reconfigure the methodology of knowledge acquisition in order to massage the sensitivities of those from different parts of the globe who may find that their long-held beliefs are being challenged. One of the essences of science, as we all know, is constant challenge. Even challenging the hypothesis of the individual scientist who starts off with an opinion, he's fairly well convinced of it, but the discipline of the scientific method means that he has to end up, if necessary, abandoning his own long-held beliefs. That is the scientific method. It's been established over centuries of trial and error itself. So the method itself has been subject to trial and error. And I worry about the idea that this is now being called into question because of a sensitivity to identity preoccupations.
And Stephen, if I can build on that, that seeped into views on Christian mission, which are therefore set in the framework of, oh well, this was an oppressive operation, hand in hand with colonialists oppressing native cultures in the name of something that was claimed to be objectively true. So there's a missiological dimension to this. Solomon Obasi keeps coming in and Solomon, I'm very interested to know what you think of all this. Are you there?
Yes. Sorry, Dr. Chris. I had to. I'm right now using my phone. Apparently, I tried to unmute myself from the computer, and it refused to allow me unmute. So I decided to connect through my phone again, so I can say a few things. Yes, I've been following through. Incidentally, for us in Africa, maybe to be more specific, in Nigeria, as has always been said, we are a highly religious people. For objectivity, for someone to come up to say that they view truth from their own perspective, for example, individuals cannot make moral judgments. They have to belong to a group, either coming from the Islamic faith, and then there is a general perspective from that angle, or belonging to the Christian faith, of which if someone speaks out and is contrary to the truth that is being held by whatever group they confess to belong with, that is truly a challenge, which is why I'm actually looking forward to listen to the next section of the lecture. But chances are very low in our own setting for space to be given to individuals to determine or direct the moral compass of a general community. But the conversations are coming in, and sadly, it is mostly among evangelicals, as we call ourselves from this end. The Pentecostals have gone way ahead in trying to say that indeed truth can be relative, which is why more churches are springing up, because some people's truth can be different from other people's truth. And through that, they pull a followership of people who cannot decide for themselves. And then they follow some philosophies, whichever way that they feel and deem it right. So maybe just to say something briefly. Thank you.
Well, there's an awful lot of very good stuff in there. It raises a whole set of different questions. I mean, one of the things that came to my mind as you were talking, Solomon, was even within Islam, there are very fundamental differences of interpretation and opinion, are there not? One group within Islam may well say that another group in Islam is wrong in its interpretation of the Quran and the Hadith and so on. So, in fact, they are appealing to the concept of truth in order to have a dialogue amongst, well, if not a dialogue, a kind of intellectual fight amongst themselves. The same would be true within the Christian faith. There are just differences of opinion where people would say, but you cannot believe that because it's not true. So you're coming back to the question of truth. On the scientific side, I would say that the whole world has to take seriously, doesn't matter where you live, what culture you come from, you have to take seriously what science has discovered about the material world in which we live. Muslims will fly, and they fly because science has discovered aerodynamics. So you're not actually denying Islam by your scientific projections, and they are of a different order, if you like. But nevertheless, truth, in my opinion, applies to both orders, whether it's a religious, ideological, the scientific, or the legal. Ask yourselves the questions, for example, how does the legal system in Nigeria work? Does it work ultimately on the basis that you are trying to discover the truth about whether something happened or didn't happen? Or are you simply trying to discover who it is that you want to penalize through the legal process? I would suggest that the best legal system is the legal system that wants to find the truth about what has actually gone on.
There's a raised hand from Frederick George as well.
Yes.
Thank you, Frederick.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Prof. My question is, do you think we really have moral truth today when you want to talk about legal truth, political truth, economic truth, religious truth, even social truth? Because I am thinking that truths have actually become something that is subjective instead of being objective. Some people don't believe in moral truth. They just believe in bigger truth. And you want to talk about, you mentioned Russia invasion of Ukraine, which was contrary to
international law.
International law. You want to talk about Hamas, Israel, Hezbollah. So, I mean, even if you pick politics alone, even religiously, why do we have so many denominations? it's on truth. No, what you are saying is not true. This is what I believe in. It's true way of doing this, and so I go out, start my own, and then so I see a kind of confusion about what is truth. Even Pilate asked Jesus, "What is truth?" So that's just what I want you to highlight, because we are living in a world of confused truth, and the confusion is so alarming in every sphere of our lives, even religious. Let me just close with an example. I went to a conference and we were talking about premarital and extramarital sex. And a pastor there, a reverend, was telling me that what's wrong with that? That we have what we call romantic movement these days, that people, you can't deny people of their passion, of their desire, just because of what I know. I said, well, this is what the Bible says. Paul wrote this, Paul wrote that. I said, no, that's the problem with you and Paul. That's why Paul confused so many people. The fact that he doesn't get married doesn't mean that he should put that kind of law on everyone. So I was alarmed that, are you not, is it not the same Bible that we are reading? He said, no, when people have is their desire, when you don't allow people to do what they desire, it can cause mental health. And as a chaplain, we have seen so many people coming with that problem. So it's not confused. So that's just what I wanted to ask you about this issue of truth. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's a very pertinent point that you've raised. You've talked about the area of well, very different areas. The areas of economics, for example, the areas of sexual relationships, and so on. I did mention that when one is looking at how you come to discover what is true about a situation, that the different areas that you are dealing with, it might be economics, it might be law, or it might be all sorts of things, particularly in the area of art and aesthetics, it's much less easy to come to a conclusion that this is the reality of the situation, that this is real, that this is truth, this is objective, when you are comparing it with science, for example, where there are all sorts of very fundamental and well experienced criteria that are to be used. And it was said earlier that in the scientific thing, nothing is ever totally, completely certain, because science goes on experimenting, goes on investigating, and as has been pointed out, one person's final theory about something can be shown to be inadequate to the facts or further facts that have been discovered. In the case of controversies, religious controversies, your person who says, well, you must, ultimately you must take for granted a person's feelings, a person's sensations, a person's emotions, a person's, and so on. And that is the most important aspect of your discussion and so on. You are actually making a truth claim. You cannot get away from it. And when you say that there's no such thing as morality, that is also a truth claim, which you then have to justify in some ways. I would say, if you say there is no such thing as morality, on what do you base that? what is your argument? Where you argue, where are you coming from? Because you've just made a truth claim. And I want to know whether that truth claim is indeed, can be justified, can be warranted, as it were. So, I don't think you can get away from the question about truth in whatever sphere you're dealing. When it comes to economics, you are in a very, very complex world, of course. No one doubts about complexity in human life. And no one doubts that there are a number of opinions, some of them completely contradictory, and so on. Nevertheless, if we are going to discuss this rationally, we have to discuss it on the basis of certain criteria. This is the point I'm trying to make, and particularly on what is the best explanation, not only for our rational reasoning, but also for our experience of life, the total experience of life. And I would say, although our cultures are different, our histories are different, and so on, a human being is a human being created in the image of God, whether they belong to different nations, to different ethnic groups, and so on and so forth. There is something fundamental about being human, and that comes out in all kinds of different examples that one could give about what happens, for example, if somebody loses somebody they love very much. I doubt that there's much difference across cultures here, the way that people react about the horrors of war and so on and so forth. So you could go on and give human beings are human beings. And that actually gives us, as somebody who reckons that we know the fundamental truth about being human, that we are created in the image of an infinite personal God, something to go on, whoever we are talking to, in whatever context.
And that deals, if I can make the point, that deals with this argument about mission as being inherently oppressive. If you just take the history of mission, for example, in Africa, where missionaries were, engaged in ending slavery in Africa because of the assertion that you've just said, Professor Andrew, that all human beings are created equal and people are not created, some to be slaves, which was part of the ideology that justified slavery. So just as you've used the example of aircraft flight to say we do assume truth in some spheres, so I think we can address this post-colonial argument about mission. That, hold on, what was the basis on which, missionaries and others, ended the whole slavery brought by the Arabs and repeated also in many parts of Africa, where one tribe was thought to be inherently inferior and therefore liable to be enslaved by others. So thank you very much. You've given us some very helpful food for thought. Victor Hosseini coming.
But please, Dr. Chris.
Fred.
Yeah, because please, even with the issue of slave trade that you just mentioned, even then, it wasn't like 100% of everyone agreed that the slave trade should be stopped. Some justified the reason for the slave trade. So what I'm saying is that sometimes, so what do we have? Is it justified truth or falsified truth? Or are we looking for absolute or rationalized truth? Because sometimes this truth is just subjective. Even culture can affect what you feel as truthful and what I feel as truthful. Culture can influence the way we look at truth. So there are all these factors that, are in place. But I like what is being said, that maybe we need to have certain criteria for real truth. Maybe that can now be a base for actually identifying the real truth. Because if not, just like the example of somebody losing a loved one, it's a universal truth that you mourn, you grieve, when a loved one is taken away from you. So that is an established truth. But there are just others that are not very clear. That's my point.
Yeah. That is a good point. I mean, to get into the argument about slavery and the abolition of slavery would take us a long way, but it's a very good example. I think a Christian, I mean, obviously we are now judging it, in hindsight, because we know that morally speaking, nobody can justify slavery. It's unjustifiable because it means that one human being has given themselves the absolute right to oppress another human being. I mentioned, for example, that the trafficking of young women, which is a particular concern of mine, across nations and so on, where the person who does the trafficking has the people who are trafficked basically as slaves. They're trafficked to a country, their passports are taken away from them. They are completely dependent on the people who have trafficked them, and so on and so forth. And this is a moral evil which has no possible justification on any grounds. The grounds that somebody has the right to do this to somebody else means, if you take the argument logically, it would mean that somebody then has the right to oppress one of the oppressors, and they could have no grounds to object to that. So, you are dealing with absolutes, I think, here and there. There are, of course, cases where it's very difficult to say what the absolute might be. In cases of, even in legal cases. But the law has taken account of that, or most legal systems have taken account of that, I would suggest. So that what comes out at the end, if it is good law, is the best possible way in which we are able to be just, but also because the scriptures demanded that we are also merciful in our justice. So, yes, but these are very good points that have been made.
Yeah, please, permit me just for the last time to give you another example.
Victor Husseini has come in. Can we let
okay,
and then come back to you? Can we let Victor? Sorry, but I think Victor Husseini has been trying to come in for some time.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm sorry I came late. I was struggling with connecting, and there's so much from what Professor Kirk had really given out this morning. But I wanted to respond to the question Professor Sutton asked earlier. He asked about the global South, and mentioning Nigeria in particular. I'm from Nigeria, but I come from northern Nigeria, where there's a lot of Islamic influence. So one thing I think that is worth considering is the fact that, though sounding basic, one of the strong dynamics that influence one's truth claim, especially in the context of the common person on the street, is allegiance to authority. And this authority might be a figure or a community. And it determines what the person holds true or not. And this, for example, in a typical northern Nigerian community, where you find that when a candidate is vying for a political position, people do not sit to think whether the person is appropriate or not. They go to the leadership, they go to the elders, to traditional rulers, and ask, who do we vote for? This, I know it will require a lot of understanding and learning and studying anthropological studies, but this is something that influences what people hold as true. So basically, when you look at northern Nigeria from the perspective of these attacks on people, the upheavals, and the rest of them, most of these have been influenced by the words of someone. They have been influenced by the voice of someone who is seen as an authority, to whom people bring kind of people allegiance have submitted their allegiance to. For example, you're mentioning about, I heard you have made a lot of inference to slavery, for example. I have heard myself, an Islamic cleric, who, when talking about his desire for Muslims to dominate the Christians in Nigeria, he did say, and I quote, though he said it in Hausa, so I'm saying it in English, he said, when we take over all that they have, we can sell some of them somewhere. That's slavery. And while he was saying that, the young men around him were screaming, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, because even the interpretation of the Quran, for example, a typical person on the street does not see the need of going into in-depth study, into understanding what the Quran says. He waits for what the cleric says, and he accepts that and believes that is true. So looking at the fact that we're expecting the next paper, I just felt like bringing this up might shed a little light. So when we look at the typical common person on the street, and one wonders what influences this person truth claim, or what he holds as truth. One major thing that requires quite a lot of study is that thing, authority, where someone, whatever the person, and somehow this even creeps into Christianity. In the context of Nigeria, you say things and say that, pick a pastor, for example, and criticize him online. A lot of people would not look at what you're saying for what it is, but rather they'll feel, how dare you? How dare you confront this person? Oh, he is this. Oh, he is that. You dare not. He's got a lot of years he's put into work. He's anointed by God. He's this and that. And that, even in Christianity, you find that at play a lot. So thank you. Sorry for my childish perspective, but then I felt like pointing this out. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to comment. I understand exactly what you're saying. But is the question never asked perhaps it is never asked by these people who submit to authority? Why should I submit to authority? Why should I submit to this particular person? What is it that is over and above any other reason why I should do this? Maybe people don't think this way. I would, one is in the realm here of what does democracy mean, if it means anything at all. if people just vote blindly, as it were, without thinking, discussing, reasoning about how they should put their vote, and just say, well, I belong to this particular group of people or this particular tribe, therefore everything that is said by the authorities in this, I have to believe. This is what I was saying, about the lack of truth acting against justice. This is not a just situation, not a just situation, at least measured by what I consider to be God's revelation of what is just about human life, what He's created. We live in a fallen world, and all sorts of examples, not least in our own lives, about how fallen we are. And we need to discern what is the truth about human life, not just pass it over to somebody else to decide for us. But I do understand, having lived in the global south myself, I do understand, that this is the way that people do decide things on the basis of authority.
Professor Andrew, we've having a very good discussion. Stephen wants to come in again. May we suggest that the second part of your lecture we take as a further lecture in our series, rather than we try and squeeze anything in at this point. So we'll round off this discussion within our time of 12:30, and then we'll talk with you about when we can schedule it in for a further lecture, if you don't mind.
Yes, I mean it is available. It is available as a text if people are interested.
Well, that can be true. We can ask for that if you could send us the text if people want to build on it immediately. But if we can discuss with you when we could fit it into our schedule, that will be
okay. The text you have, not you personally, but Anna has the text.
I'll be very happy to share it, and my colleague Andrew will help me.
Yeah, and Andre has the text. Is it
what
Andre?
What do you think about the suggestion to actually have a follow-up lecture on the second part?
It wouldn't be such a long lecture.
But we seem to have really good discussion. We seem to have really good discussion.
Plenty of discussion. But it would be basically on what I conceive to be the biblical teaching on how the mind should be renewed and how that is possible. That's really what it was about, or what it is about. But yes, I mean, if you wish to schedule a second part to the talk,
we'll be in discussion with you on that outside the lecture. But Stephen wants to come in, and then we'll probably need to round it off. Stephen.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I was just commenting on Victor Hosseini's very interesting his observation about the problem of authority, and even affecting something like slavery. It comes down to this issue, the problem of a cultural value as determining what truth is. And I think, Dr. Kirk, you brought this up in detail about the problem of determining what truth is. And of course, as we know, culture is really not a watertight concept. I think this is the problem with, we certainly find this in our own culture, and also cultures, outside the Western neighborhood, as it were. It's not a watertight concept, but it's a common selection of what are accepted values. And this idea of countering and it causing cultural damage or undermining authority by challenging it. Yet, I suppose the argument we could use here is that, well, every culture, as you mentioned, Dr. Kirk, there's a great deal of diversity. It isn't an established set of values. That means that a choice in that cultural heritage, a choice was made in that cultural group as to what constituted the culture, what constituted the unmovables in it, the movables and the unmovables. But there's no reason, moral or otherwise, for any person in any culture to accept it as an authority or to avoid challenge. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that famous dictum of Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living, in the sense that all these things they revivify, they strengthen culture if it is constantly challenged. If it's not challenged, it becomes ossified and it becomes a sort of an oppressive system. I'm not going down that strange route that the postmodernists went to try and make out that all culture is about oppression or victim or oppressor. But the fact is that cultures do have a wide range of different opinions. And the problem is that certain groups have been able to, shall we say, impose what is the orthodoxy of a culture. What is fascinating about the Christian heritage is the wide diversity, the constant diversity of opinions and groups, as a result of which Christianity, more than any other religion, has been able to negotiate and navigate modernity and all the challenges of science in a way that other faiths have not been able to do, because they have not tested themselves by accepting the idea of challenge and responding to challenge.
Mm. Yes, I mean, I think it hinges on your. I was just going to say it hinges on your worldview, doesn't it? Ultimately, what are the fundamental points of what it means to be human, ultimately, and accepting the authority of anybody without any question whatsoever diminishes your humanity, diminishes who you are as a human being. This would be one argument, because we do know what it means to be human, because we've been told what it means to be human, and that has been borne out in so many different ways. One way is it does not mean being human does not mean being a slave. That is quite clear. I know there's some argument about what the New Testament says about slavery, but I think there are good reasons to counter those arguments, as Paul himself began to do. So yes, I think this question of what is the best way of being human. I mean, it has been said, I'm not an apologist necessarily for the Christian faith, but I am an apologist for what the Christian faith says about what it means to be human.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Andre, or Professor Andre, we don't seem to have more questions coming, but I really appreciate, it's been such a lively discussion that we've done something unprecedented. We suggested to divide your lecture in two parts, and really hope there'll be a follow-up. And thank you so much to agreeing to that. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. Stephen just posted a few references to the Quran, but thank you so much. There was quite a few live questions as well, and that made this discussion even more engaging, because usually we accept the the chats, but I think it really touched the nerve of people, and there was very genuine responses. Dr. Chris, I also appreciate your facilitation of discussion, and Stephen as always, and we have got a few comments from Salman and Frederick. Really, really great. Thank you so much, everyone, particularly Dr. Andrew, Professor Andrew. Apologies. Great time together. Yes, exactly. If you can please join Dr. Chris. Virtual applause to our speaker, just as a sign of appreciation. And we will communicate on 2 points. First, actually 3 points, when we'll hope to have the follow-up lecture. Then you kindly shared your text, so we'll share it with other participants. And thirdly, we also recording this lecture, so we'll make it available online on our website, if it's okay with you, Professor Andrew. Is it okay to put it on the OCRPL website? Will that be okay?
I don't think he's heard you.
Oh dear. Professor Andrew, is it okay if we post the lecture online? Because we've been recording it, and usually we post the lectures on the OCRPL website. Will it be okay with you, Professor Andrew? Okay, I'll follow it up on. But so far so good. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Wishing you a nice day, and thank you for joining us today. And thank you and goodbye, everyone.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the discussion and all the comments that have been made, which are very, very valuable. I appreciate that.
Did you hear her ask if we could put it online on the website, Andrew? No, I don't think his sound's working. Okay.
Dr. Andrew, is it okay to put the lecture online? We have been recording it.
Is he muted? Is his sound muted?
Oh dear.
Well, you'll sort that out anyway.
Okay. Well, thank you and goodbye then. I'll follow up by email. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.